So tonight we're going to just focus on really Fresno County area. And what we're going to do with this presentation is focus on some, but not all, the sparrows that you can see. First, let me start off here with a couple of things. One, if you'll notice in the upper left-hand corner, there's the number 2. That's the that is this slide number. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, if you take note of that slide number, it makes it easier for me. I can go back to that slide very quickly to go over any questions at that time. Also, just a quick mention of credits. There's several photographs that are mine, but there's also quite a few in here that are from the Academy of Natural Sciences, and then some other people that I know. Robert Shantz is a primary contributor. I'm going to have graphs and charts in here from eBird, and I'm going to give some links that you can use if you want to look at these. But otherwise, the presentation's all of mine and of my creation here. So, all right. So as I mentioned here, we're going to be looking at our spring migrants and the spring sparrows here, but not all of them. And really, what I'm hoping to do this evening is kind of give an introduction to some of the sparrows that have similar characteristics, and then give some ways to consider about helping identify them and differentiate them. And by doing that, we're going to in part look at habitat, and then look at how eBird and other resources might help with recognizing those features. And then we'll also talk about the specific characteristics that work with when you're looking at the individual birds to identify them. So, all right. First, I'd like to give a quick overview here of some of the resources I'm using from eBird. eBird now has some wonderful maps and graphics and animations that you can look at and go online, and they cover a large number of species here. You can see here on the left all these various species. All these various maps that they have for many of the species, not all, but many of the species that we can see here in North America. And this is a range map. I am mostly going to be using the abundance maps. I'll be focusing on the pre-breeding migration, because this really fits into the time frame that we're talking about. So really what I'm talking about here is this time of year, getting into March, April, May. And I tried my best here to put up Fresno County on the maps so that we get a better feel for where you fall in that. And if you look at these abundance maps, this really kind of demonstrates the darker the color, the higher the number of individuals that you might see in that area. So as you can see, if you move up here to the Midwest and whatnot, the abundance of the white-crowned sparrows decreases. So that gives you an idea there, looking at the map, what that's supposed to be. But the other thing I also want to bring into view is the habitat. And really, of course, that's a key thing for identification of species, recognizing the habitat that they're in. And this chart that they have for the individual species, this is for California. It really covers a wide range of habitats here. And there's some interesting information that could be useful, land managers and so forth, whether there's a high chance this is a greater than 0% chance of seeing it. And this is a reduced chance of seeing species or seeing that species in these sorts of habitats like roads and nighttime lights. These are some of the things they're doing to look at for impact from, let's say, for birds flying at night and how lights might be impacting migration. But in general, I don't want to focus too much on the less than 0%. And really, I'm going to block that out for all the presentation. We'll just be looking at places where we're most likely to see them. So, all right. Well, let's jump into the species identification. Now we're going to cover about 4 or 5 genera here tonight, and we're going to start out with the number 1 species, and also the genus Zonotrichia, but the number 1 species that you can see in terms of sparrows, at least at this time of year, according to the Great Backyard Bird Count data. And you know, the white-crowned sparrows are the ones that, of course, can be most prevalent. Now, you know, Zonotrichia is a very a fun genus, I think, and characteristically, they're very curious, I would say, or at least in the sense they're not as skittish and skulky as some of our sparrows are. They perch up a lot, and they're also in large groups together. So it makes observing this genus usually pretty easy, and they're a lot of fun to watch. All right, well, I'm going to start off here with some of the range maps for these three species we're going to talk about: the white-crowned, golden-crowned, and then white-throated sparrow. And you can look and see just here in the overall abundance. The white-throated sparrow, of course, is more of a rare bird that might be overwintering here, but in general, it's not one that you expect to see with high frequency out there. Whereas the white-crowned sparrow, of course, is you can see quite abundant this time of year. And the golden crown, as it's moving through and moving north, is going to be out there in pretty good numbers as well. So now, since the white-throated sparrow is just a rare bird, there's really not much in the way of habitat data from eBird, but there is for both the golden crown sparrow here up on top, and then the white-crowned sparrow here on the bottom. And the key thing I just want to point out, if you look here, overall, of course, the golden crown migrates away, so there's no data. And then the white crowns here are, they're here, and there's breeders, not necessarily just like parts of over in the Sierras of one of the subspecies. But if you look here, I just want to kind of point out, really what we see with Zonotrichia is quite a affinity for open sort of forest land or forested areas. Of course, we can see them in some barren areas here, and they also have them in herbaceous wetlands that we can see them. But really, overall, Zonotrichia is a species that likes to be in areas where there's a lot of brush trees and usually a fairly dense sort of habitat, and a place that you can one of the places that you can see, of course, is at Lost Lake Park there in the central part of Fresno County. This is a good example of some of the sort of habitat that you would see, that you'd be able to see the Zonotrichia species in here. There's, well, of course, with the water and all, of course, we have a lot of brushy sort of habitat in here, willow species and other deciduous species too. So it's a great place to find them. But at the same time, we also have open areas, and that's really a key thing with all of our sparrows, I would say. Having this open sort of habitat really makes a difference with as far as we expect to see them. So all sparrows tend to have it's not like a woodland. We don't consider sparrows a species of woodland. There are sparrows that we can find in woodland areas, but generally we want to see open areas, whether it's meadows or other sort of habitat nearby. All right, and I'm just hoping that my my internet connection is doing okay with you guys too. Let me see. I may stop my video just to make sure I have enough bandwidth. I'm going to do that for now. All right. All right, well, back to Zonotrichia here. So this is a white-crowned sparrow. This is an immature white-crowned sparrow. And at this time of year, you're less likely to actually run into individuals that look like this. But I feel like I'd be amiss to not discuss them. And so I wanted to at least talk a little bit about the molt cycle that we see for our Zonotrichia. Now, Zonotrichia is one of those genera among our sparrows where we can actually have an immature or first winter plumage. And so during the wintertime, we might see individuals that look very similar in size and shape, but their markings are different. And sometimes that throws people. There is a fledgling plumage, but generally we don't see that by the time they come down from migration to overwinter. They're just in their first winter plumage. And this time of year, that's very possible. You can see birds like this that are transitioning into their alternate or breeding plumage here. And really for the white crowns, this is also their adult plumage, which they'll wear for the remainder of their life. And so again, here's some molting of the brownish and some of the tannish feathers into the white and the black. But mostly we're going to be seeing these winter adults. So, but I did want to show just some of these pictures of these immatures here, because if you look at these, here's one again that's molting into the breeding plumage in the spring here as well. But if you look at these individuals, they're all very similar in their shape, and shape is really one of the key things look at when we're identifying all birds, sparrows included. And one thing about our zonotrichia is they have what I call a pretty average bill size in terms of length and overall height with it. They have nice long tails, a fairly long primary projection because they do some long distance migration. And then of course, a lot of head patterning, which is very characteristic with all of our sparrows, but noticeably so for this genus Zonotrichia. Now, if you look at these individuals here, there is one here, of course, that has color in the lores, and the color in the lores is really helpful, a really helpful characteristic when you start looking at the white crown sparrows. One of the fun things about white crowns, of course, is there's 5 different recognized subspecies, and here in California, it's a great place to get a chance to compare some of these. And actually, Fresno County provides you an opportunity to see some of our gambles subspecies here in the wintertime. And then, of course, we have the Putagensis and Nuttallii, which are very similar to California and coastal breeding white crown sparrows. And then really don't expect to see them unless you go over to the far eastern side of the state, and during breeding season, the Oriantha subspecies here, which has the dark and the lores. So pretty much this time of year, when you're out there looking around in places like Lox Lake Park, key characteristics to look for to help distinguish them are the lores. What's the color of the lores? The color of the bill. Putagensis and Nuttallii have a paler, yellower bill versus the oranger bills here of Oriantha and the gambles. And then also the color of the back. The color of the back tends to be more brownish on our gambles, and it's a paler, it's a brighter, and there's more contrast with the streaking that comes down the back with our Nuttallii and Putagensis. So this is a fun thing to look for while you're out there in the field with these, and documenting those subspecies, of course, I think is something that over time could be really important, as who knows what's going to happen as the climate changes and how these species change and subspecies change with their ranges. So it's something I think it's important, if you can, to document when you're out in the field. Well, another Zonotrichia that see regularly out here is, of course, our golden crowned, and this is what our individuals are looking at right now. And of course, they have the nice gold and the median crown stripe with these adult males to the really pronounced it's sort of like your supercilium that goes into your lateral crown stripes, but really striking. Now, some individuals, based on gender, but also time of season, and as well as age of the individuals, may look a little more like this or this right now, this time of year, but they all should be pretty far along, or going far along into getting into this full adult sort of a plumage. Again, with same sort of thing with the white crown sparrows, they're gregarious, tend to be in a flock together. Of course, we can see individuals mixing in the flock, but overall, I would say that golden crown tends to be a little more denser, likes a little more density within the habitat, perhaps more thick foliage and more brush and tree around in the area. So since we're looking at the plumages over time, one thing I want to mention here just for consideration is that compared to the white crown sparrow, the golden crown sparrow will actually go through a plumage, a basic sort of a plumage, what we call basic plumage, or a wintering plumage, and will look more like this in the winter time. Now these are some immatures, and then perhaps a young first winter birds here, but this is not an unusual plumage to see early on in winter, and then they will slowly molt their way from here and into here. So that's something that's kind of interesting with our golden crowns, and sometimes can throw people when they see a wintering golden crown sparrow. Now moving on to the rarer of the three, the white-throated sparrow. And of course, the best place to look for white-throated sparrow is with other Zonotrichia. And being gregarious and flocking in the winter, like a lot of sparrows, but especially Arizona trichia, they often are found in with a mixed flock that way. And one of the neat things about white-throated sparrows are the differences between the tan stripe and the white stripe. Now this looks rather much like kind of like a white-crowned sparrow, but with yellow in the supraloral region here and a much more pronounced white underneath the throat there. Of course, this is pretty striking. And when you get to the tan stripe, though, it's a little more subtle there. Shows some of the same characteristics, white in the throat, and sometimes it could be a little bit more obvious. But overall, they're a little more subtle, but probably less likely to be confused with anything else out there. At most, maybe a golden crown in the winter. But the neatest thing about this is that this is a polymorphic plumage, and the tan stripe and white stripe, among our zona trichia, but at least among almost any species of bird, it's highly unusual to find two dramatically different field marks at this level. That's not based on age or gender, and it's considered a polymorphic plumage. Again, here two plumage types, and the neat thing about it is that the white stripes tend to have more testosterone, whether it's male or female, versus the tan stripes. And so what happens is there's this what they call it's a dissociative mating. And what happens is the white stripe always mates, not always, but almost always mates with a tan stripe. And it's a male female. If it's a male white stripe versus with a female tan stripe, or male tan stripe with a female white stripe, what happens is the white stripes with the higher testosterone tend to be a little bit more aggressive, whether it's male or female, and better at defending the territory, whereas the tan stripes tend to be a little bit better, whether it's the male or female, at raising the young and getting those fledglings out of the nest. And so it works out to be a very functional sort of behavior that keeps these characteristics, these traits, persisting within the gene flow. And for those who are into genetics, it's actually a pericentric inversion that causes this variation in the plumage. So, but I'll leave that for somebody else to go into more detail on. All right, we're gonna switch on over to the next genus that we'll kind of compare, which is Spizella. And this is, of course, a chipping sparrow, all glorious in their plumage. You know, sparrows are not always appreciated the same way as, let's say, the warblers or other brightly colored birds. But even though there's a lot of earth tones with our sparrows, there can be really just wonderful colorations. It's like that steely gray color of the rump there, and these buffy and oranges and reddish oranges with the crown patterns and all. It's beautiful birds. So let's talk about Spizella. Spizella is this genus is one of our smallest species of sparrows out there. And if you look at the brewer sparrows, which we will, they really have the smallest, most petite bill of all the sparrow species we have here in North America. But chipping sparrows kind of fall in that category too. Now, even though they're really small in size, they're quite long if you put their tail into the picture. And so it gives them this real slender sort of shape. And just like zona trichia, they also tend to hang out in flocks together. So it's one way to see them. Now, if you look at the maps here, this is the migration maps again with the abundance. Chipping sparrows is who we're more likely to see. But if you look at the area that we're more likely to find them, of course, there's this whole, we start getting up into the Sierras and these mountain areas, mountain ranges, the coastal mountains there. And this is where they wind up breeding typically too as well. So this ties in with their habitat selection. Spizella, our chipping sparrows, this is one of the species that likes to breed in woodland areas. Again, when we find them, they still like to be in more open habitat. or have open habitat available to them in meadows. They're not going to be in dense forested areas, but nonetheless, we really can see this in the range map. And if you look here at the brewer sparrows, which will breed over here on the eastern side of the state, but really we're looking at them down the valley here, using these migratory corridors, and not so much the montane species. This is more of a drier valley species here. Now, if you look at the habitat too, this basically shows the same sort of thing. We're talking about whether it's more forested, and again, it's still open. And here we get into more just shrublands with the brewer sparrows. And really what we're also seeing here too, if you think about it, is a wetter to a drier, more mesic to more xeric sort of habitat selection as well. And I think one of my goals with this is to looking at these charts sometimes can be intimidating, but the key idea here is whether you go to your guidebook or any other resource to get an idea of the habitat you might find them in. You know, one of course, is the plant types and whatnot, but the other real key element, I think, is looking at the range of moisture in the habitat that you can see. And of course, we get up to the higher elevations, just by default at higher elevation, there's more moisture, more rainfall, and we see much more trees. And this is a good example of up in the Sierras of the sort of habitat with a meadow in here that we'd have for breeding habitat for the chipping sparrows. Now here, getting down into the flats here in the central part of Fresno County, Dry Creek Reservoir as actually it's a great place for seeing a lot of our sparrows. It's got a nice mix of a little more xeric sort of habitat, a lot of more open space, but there's still a lot of trees and brush around. So in migration, this is a good spot to go and try and see many of these sparrow species here. But of course, it's quite a bit different than what we're looking at here in this sort of upland breeding habitat. But in migration, again, the chipping sparrows that are heading north, this is an area that they'll move through. So it is possible to see both brewers and chipping sparrows down in this sort of habitat. Well, I'm going to start off first. You're looking at the brewer sparrows. You're less likely to see brewer sparrows, I would say, compared to the chipping sparrows. But there are some characteristics when you do see them that'll help. Brewer sparrows, this bill doesn't look as tiny as you'd imagine. Here, of course, these photographs really give you a close-in look. But when you're looking through your binoculars at any sort of distance, the bill sometimes even fades away. It's so petite. But there's some really nice characteristics here. Again, this is the classic Spizella long sort of profile, real long tail again, long primaries. And then we've got the head markings that we see with all of our sparrows. And one of the things that's really notable for brewer sparrows as compared to chipping is the lack of any color in the lores and this nice complete eye ring. That complete eye ring can really stand out. It can really pop it at a distance sometimes. And that's very helpful. When you compare that to the chipping sparrow here, you'll notice that they have the color in the lores, but tied in with that whole eye line, you wind up getting color in the eye ring too. So really like an upper eye arc and a lower eye arc. It shows up really well in this immature photo right here as well. And so all these are chipping sparrows. And again, the nice gray rump, but sometimes that's hidden by the wings folded over. The red crown here and full breeding plumage can sometimes be a little less obvious because they'll have streaking through it through the winter. And so this is one of those characteristics as far as molt goes that I thought I'd share with you again here too. We're not going to be seeing any fledglings at this point in the time, but if you go up into the Sierras here come at summertime, you might be seeing some of these sorts of plumages out there. And then you get to our immature birds. And sometimes that might throw people because they look at the crown. But again, we still have that complete eye line and the eye arcs there. And the overall shape, this long shape with the long tail that really characterizes our Spizella. But what happens here is that our chipping sparrows are a lot like the golden crowns in that they have a winter plumage and a breeding plumage. And during that time, you can have more or less streaking through the crown and it's not a solid cap. And it can be pretty interesting to see that because especially early on in the winter, it can make the crown look a little bit different than what you might expect. But And I've got a picture here of the crowns to compare the two. So we do see the streaking through the crowns. This is a brewer sparrow up here, and this is a chipping sparrow. This is a complete crown. You can see some little bit of flecks of black in there, but it's not really streaked. Here's some more streaking here in this winter individual. And then this is an immature chipping sparrow here. So you can see the difference between the two, between immature versus an adult. And then again, the brewer sparrow, but the brewer sparrows has a complete eye ring versus the split eye ring again, and no color in the lores. And you can see where maybe there's some similarities here in this patterning, how it looks for the crown. The bottom line is that chipping sparrows are much warmer. You can see all these buffies and kind of browns coming in. The gray is just warmer overall. And so this color tone usually is quite evident between the two, and you wouldn't confuse or should not confuse an immature of the chipping sparrow versus the brewer sparrow. All right, well, we're going to move on to two different genera here, and Poacetes and Pisciculus, and actually these are, you know, some of my favorite genera to look at. They're not necessarily uncommon. You can see them side by side sometimes in the same habitat, and the Vesper sparrow here on the left and the Savannah sparrow here on the right. So you can see them out there together, and they can be challenging to tell apart sometimes. They're close in size, and but there are some differences here. We're going to go over those, of course. Now, if you look at the overall expected range here for the Vesper sparrow versus the Savannah sparrow, there's, of course, much greater odds of seeing Savannah sparrow. And in fact, Savannah sparrows is another one of those sparrows that was pretty high on the list of number of individuals seen during the Great Backyard Bird Count here, you know, just a couple weeks ago. But if you look overall, again, I want to make you think about in terms of the whole idea of here is not just the abundance, but where are they found? Where are we seeing these birds? And of course, they're not in the Sierras. These are not mountain birds. These are birds of the valleys, the lowlands. But there is an area where we're seeing them concentrated, has a lot to do, again, with their habitat selection. There's a lot of overlap, but overall, I would say that, you know, Vesper is our species of drier, more xeric habitat. Whereas when you get the water, moisture, so you look at all the herbaceous woodland, herbaceous croplands, the lakes and whatnot, Savannah sparrows, they're more inclined towards the more moist sort of habitat, the more mesic habitat. And so that's one good clue when you're pulling apart. And I even see it on a micro scale in areas, even on where I live. I've got both Savannah and Vespers here together. And you can really see how it seems like the Savannahs just want to stay closer to the pond. And the Vesper sparrows they'll come in to drink, but the rest of the time they'll be further away, you know, a football field distance away. So that sort of those affinities can be helpful looking at them. Now, again, when we talked about a dry creek reservoir, a great place to go see both these species. But if you go to Western Fresno County, get up into the foothills here, and this area is a great area to see both the species as well. Now, if you look at it here, notice that we're starting to get to more open areas. Now you can see Savannah sparrows in agricultural fields, another wide open area. And again, here out the grasslands, but it's not completely open. We do see a little bit of, we still have trees and vegetation around. But what I also want to draw your attention to is just think about Zonotrichia. We're talking about Zonotrichia, and even Spizella. This area is less ideal for them because there's not as much of the brushier herbaceous or trees out there in the habitat. And that's one of the things you're looking for, again, when you're identifying, is just what do you expect in this sort of a habitat. Here's another place where you can see both these species, a little bit wetter here at Mercy Hot Springs, and a little bit more vegetation as a result. And this area, of course, with this more mesic habitat, tends to have a higher number of Savannah sparrows versus just the surrounding outlying area, but just some ideas of what you might see when you're separating these two. But side by side, in general, Savannah sparrow is a little bit smaller than the Vesper sparrow, and the tail's a little bit shorter. Um, but those things can still be hard to even tell side by side. So characteristics here, of course, Vesper sparrows have that wonderful bay on the wing, but a lot of times those, because that is like in the area of the carpals, and a lot of times the feathers on the breast are covering them to keep their hands warm, of course, for flight. But it's something that if you're there, you can see it, that's a real obvious characteristic. But again, when you look at the patterning here, the head patterns are something we really look at with sparrows. And then we can also look at the streaking pattern too. In general, these are generalisms. Vesper sparrows have a U-shaped sort of streaking pattern. So it's up on the breast and it extends on the flanks, but it doesn't come off the same way. It's more of a V shape, let's say. So the streaking starts to come off the breast before you get to the flanks for the Savannah sparrow versus the Vesper. And then if you look at the facial patterns here, one thing that I really like about Vesper sparrows is this eye-ring. This eye-ring really pops. And if you think about why, if you look at it, they share very similar facial patterns here, but this supercilium, this eyebrow, gets really streaky on the Vesper sparrow, where it stays pretty clean on the Savannah. And so what happens with the Savannah here, that eye ring, and also this color of the eye ring, even though they got a complete eye ring, just like the Vesper, it's about the same color here as the eyebrow, so it kind of blends in. Now this is pretty close to the same color as eyebrow too, but not with all the streaking. So that helps this whole eye ring kind of stand out, kind of pops that way. Some people like this sort of J look on Vesper sparrows, but you can also sometimes see that on Savannahs as well. Another characteristic we can see in other places is this white thin, but white meaning crown stripe that we have on our Savannah sparrows. And that can really help here. This meaning crown stripe here, they like to crest their crown. That, when they do that, that white can pop at a great distance and be visible in the binoculars here. Now you notice I haven't talked too much about the white and the yellow and the wars. And one reason for that, again, is because that can vary between individuals and subspecies. And so it's not something I call out it's a nice characteristic to see, and it can be helped with identifying it, but I don't consider it a primary characteristic. But again, look at the eye ring comparison. Even in shadow here, that white eye ring still pops really nice on that Vesper, and that thin meaning crown stripe really stands out. So, and lastly, you know what, I'll go back really fast. In flight, of course, there's white on the outer tail feathers of the Vesper sparrow, and I don't have that in this presentation here, but that is something in flight when they fly away that can be helpful in also identifying them too. All right, we're shifting into our last genus for the evening, and I can't even see my clock, so I'm trying to keep the presentation on schedule, and hopefully I'm doing that. But I don't know if I'm going fast or slow, but we're going to finish off with probably one of the more challenging identifications with our similar species that can be seen out here. And of course, the sage sparrow split, which left us with the bells and the sagebrush sparrow. So, and here we are. They're running around on the ground. That's a pretty good characteristic of these guys. Well, if you look at the sagebrush sparrow versus the bell sparrow, you know, they're less likely to be observed, but this is an abundance map, and there are breeding individuals apparently. And if you look at some of the historic range of what we call now the sagebrush sparrow, it kind of extended into this area over here. So, so there's still some individuals we expect to see, and in the same area of habitat here, but we kind of consider the bells to be more the coastal species, whereas the sagebrush tends to be a little bit more of an interior species between the two. And then when it comes to the habitat, they're very similar. They really like these sorts of sparse sort of habitat, herbaceous, nothing really tall, not necessarily a bunch of trees around. The biggest difference really between the bells and the sagebrushes. The sagebrush can go into even, they call it barren here, but definitely more open, more sparse versus the bells. So if we're going to talk about an inclination here, coastal versus interior, kind of makes sense that bells would be a little more mesic and sagebrush should be a little bit more xeric. But again, we're going to talk about birds that are really, really similar in appearance. And um, and of course, that's one reason they're really close as far as when we've decided they diverge into two separate species. And that's one reason why there's not as much difference between the habitat as well. Now, this area is a great area to go and see both species. Your probability is higher to see bells versus a sagebrush, but it is the area to go and try and see them over in the western part of the county. Now, as I mentioned, behavior-wise, these birds love to spend their time running around on the ground, and that's one of the ways. Just behavior, I haven't talked about as much with this part, except for flocking behavior. But this just the behavior of running the ground. All the sparrows can do that. But one thing they do, they have a nice long tail. So they really cock that tail up while they're running around. And that's a really useful sort of characteristic. And it's true for both the bells and the sagebrush. I'll point out when we are talking about habitat a little bit, those Artemisia californica, but there's quite a few species out there. This is, of course, this is kind of where the new name for that genus is derived from the sagebrush. And so this is also an area where if you see that this is a plant that they like, there's an affinity for that. And so it's a good area to start thinking, I keep an eye out and see what I see. All right, telling the two apart. Bottom line, they share pretty much the same sort of markings, but we have the coastal bells versus the more interior sagebrush. And kind of following that rule of thumb, when you're more exposed to moisture, you tend to have more melanins and whatnot, so you're darker overall. You start moving towards the interior, especially in the interior west, which is drier, and we tend to become paler overall. So just a simple rule of thumb to help tell them apart. So bells is darker and by default has more melanins, and just on the back, it tends to look browner, whereas it's paler on the back of the sagebrush. And one way to, sometimes it's hard to see that in the field. So if you look at the tail feathers are dark on both of them. And of course, that's because they need the melanins in there. You got to keep those feathers from wearing too much. So they're both going to be dark. They're similar, let's say, in darkness. Relative darkness is about the same between the back and the tail for the bells, whereas the tail looks darker than the back of the sagebrush. Now, another thing too is that there's this fine streaking that we can really see on both, but what happens is that there's less contrast between the dark sort of feathers between the streaks, whereas it's much paler on the back of the sagebrush, so the streaking stands out more. And then, of course, tied with that, there's the striping and around the eye line and the malar stripe and all. There's more melanins there, and they just are darker and stand out more. So just a different view. Sometimes they get to be dark enough with our coastal bells that you can see a spot even on the breast, but not to say that you couldn't see that sometimes on our sagebrush as well. But there's a view from the front, and again, not that malar stripe is not quite as broad, not quite as dark, but otherwise they look very similar there. And I don't like to use the gray because the grays oftentimes can look darker on the bells, but not always. So those are some of the basic characteristics to help tell them apart. It's really useful to see them from behind, to be honest. So now I'm going to show one of the range maps here. This is back from the 1944 California birds. I'm trying to remember the author, but anyhow, if you look here, this back then was all Amphispisa, but now the bells, of course, this one here is our bells, but this was the intermediate sage sparrow, which is now also sagebrush. And you can see in this area here where we're looking at as far as where they could breed, they're right on the cusp of each other. So this is where we can see them both breeding together, and it can be tricky. So for those of you who are really interested in going to depth on them, Los Angeles birders here, let's see, Kimball Garrett, Andy Birch, they have an hour-long presentation here that's a webinar that it's just a couple years old, and they discuss it in detail for those who are really hardcore. So that's a good place to go and learn more about differentiating. But the thing I'll point out here is headache-inducing identification challenges. There you go. I think that says it all. So, well, I don't know how fast I went through this, but I'm trying to time this to keep it around 45 minutes, and I can't even see my clock right now. So, and I hid my cell phone. So I'm going to move on to the last part. Basically, I'm wrapping things up here now, and but I did want to, if I hope it's okay to have a couple of quick infomercials. One is I just want to talk about Wings to Willcox. This is a festival that I run here in Southeast Arizona. It's a winter festival. It's in January. And this year we're coming up in January. Hopefully we're COVID free. And Rick Wright will be talking about sparrows because he came out, excuse me, with the Peterson guide for that. And so if you want to learn more about sparrows, that could be a fun opportunity. And then I've also done the ABA Institutes for Field Ornithology, typically in January. COVID's kind of impacted those, but those are week-long, more intensive sort of sparrow workshops too. And if anybody's interested, I just wanted to put the word out there for those who might want to know. So, but anyhow, that's it from my end. So, all right, I'm okay on time. Oh, look at that, I am on time. There's a little, okay.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you, Homer. So I am going to jump into the chat box. I know that we have at least one question. So if any of you have any questions for Homer, go ahead and type those into the chat box and I will read them off one by one. So we're going to go ahead and dive into that. Let's see what so we have one question, and this is from Gary, and he asked, did you Photoshop the bullet holes out of the commercial sign?
Well, I wish I could take credit. Somebody else must have, because I'm not, honestly haven't birded very much at all. I've done some birding this year, but not much in the Fresno County area overall. And so that's not my photo. I grabbed that one offline, and maybe they did. Probably the BLM photos. They fixed it.
Nice. All right. Does anyone else? Oh, here we go. So, okay. So Nancy Gilmore dropped a link in the chat box for more info on Wings over Willcox. Thank you, Nancy. All right. So again, everyone, if you have any questions, now is the perfect time to go ahead and drop them in the chat box. We don't have any in the queue right now, so type one in, you'll be first up.
All right. I can also make available the links for those who are interested in looking at any of the eBird charts. It's easy to access those, and it's one of probably the most fascinating things to look at with the eBird, or the animated GIFs that they can play to look at the migration and movement of the birds through there. I think it's worth it for that alone. So, oh my gosh, somebody's gonna ask me, frequent is the grasshopper sparrow in Fresno County? Boy, and I'm not a California bird expert. Arizona's my place. But what I would suggest, if you look at the overall habitat, there's not much habitat that's suitable overall. So I think it's on the range of kind of like the white-throated sparrow. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't, I think it's in the rare bird category there. So I'm not the Fresno County expert. And I should have probably spent more time, knowing all the range maps for just the county, but I apologize for not doing that.
Well, that's okay. We've been getting a lot of compliments here, and this is an excellent presentation. Let's go through some of the compliments, since we're not getting a lot of questions quite yet.
Yeah.
So Susan Joy said,
fine.
Thank you for this great presentation. My eyes are open wider to these little brown birds. Awesome. Yeah, I'll admit, when I first started birding, I was very intimidated by sparrows, but taking it starting with the easy ones, like your white crowned sparrows, golden crowned sparrows, ones that are easy to distinguish from others, and then just kind of building from there and taking it bit by bit. And paying attention to the fine details that, Homer was pointing out. It's super helpful and it becomes a lot of fun. So Gary says, excellent, Homer, very well done. Terry Broderick says, thank you. I'm new to the group and I enjoyed the presentation. Nancy Gilmore says, thank you for the additional eBird info. And Karen Cobb says, so great to have something specific to our county. Thank you for compiling all the data. And Iris says, thank you very much. So not a lot of questions, but certainly a lot of compliments so far.
Good. Well, let's see. I'm just looking at, so if you get into really in Fresno County, where I'm seeing as far as like, you might have some wintering individuals. They don't breed in Fresno County, looks like to me, as far as the range map goes. For this grasshopper sparrow, and I would imagine again the abundance is pretty low, and I think a lot of it has to do with habitat too. If you look at the old range of the interior, so to speak, sage sparrow or the the sagebrush sparrow, and how that is just no longer really not there anymore, just from encroachment on habitat. I think that drives a lot of it. I would suggest in the past, 50, 60 years ago was much more abundant than it is now. So, and this was really partly for time, focused on just a few species and similar species, but there are some wonderful, I would highly recommend, just looking out for those Lincolns and song sparrows. Those are beautiful birds, and they're well worth chasing. Of course, the lark sparrow, and these are all more common species that you could look for when you're out there birding as well. So, and if I was to make an identification comment, the way I would think about Lincoln sparrow, Savannah sparrows are actually pretty similar in size, and their plumages, as far as the patterning, is very similar. It's more, the differences is more the colors, what the colors are. So whereas it's more of a white and tannish brown with the Savannah sparrow for the head patterns, it's more of a gray and a reddish brown for the Lincoln sparrow, but otherwise similar. So, and those are things, if we had more time, we could just look at and put together for comparisons and stuff. And of course, this is my very first Fresno County presentation ever. You guys got the first run of this one. So.
Well, it doesn't seem like anyone has any complaints. So you got 2 more compliments. 2 people say thank you, an excellent presentation. And you do have another question that came in just a few moments ago. Matthew asks, could you please give a brief rundown on how the charts that had the habitat types listed in different colors work?
I can. Let me go back. I think I'm still screen sharing here, right? You can still see it.
Let me get out of the chat, and yes, you are.
Okay, and now let me make sure I'm in this is what we're talking about, the habitat regional charts. So it's, I have to admit, I think it is confusing. But what eBird's trying to do here with this, with these charts, is to look at, what sort of habitat associations we're seeing for an individual species, how it correlates with the time of year, and then also make this data useful for land managers. And when I say land managers, let's say it's the BLM or Conservation Society or whatever. So, but if we look at this overall chart, this is a graph over the year. So this is January, here's May, here's August, December. So this is the year cycle here. And if we look at this is sort of an abundance sort of a chart in the sense. So if we look at the white-crowned sparrow here in California, now this is for the entire state, mind you, okay? This is not just Fresno County. This couldn't be narrowed down, but there's a lot of white-crowned sparrows here in the wintertime that overwinter. And of course, the real peak is in the fall through December. And then starting in January, February, they slowly decline as they're leaving, and then really drops off precipitously. But we do have, some breeding populations there, the Oriantha, over on the western part of the state in the Sierras and whatnot. So that's what you see here with this top part. And then when you look at this is like a relative percent, like from, let's say it's from 0 to 100 hypothetically, and this is the negative. So this is like a positive, what they call a positive association. So it means if you go out there in, let's say, November, you're most likely to see them in this, whether sparse forest or an open forest. And and then maybe some evergreens. This is where your highest association for that is. Now, obviously, if you get down to the park, parks is a man-made habitat, but it shares characteristics that they like, which is really just, when they say open or sparse forest, it means habitat that has trees, larger trees versus herbaceous and shrubs. Okay. Now, these are what they call negative associations. Doesn't mean you can't see them in there, but the more, and I have to admit, I'm not sure that I completely understand it. Parts of this, some of these negative associations, we obviously can see them around wetlands and so forth. And of course, this is in the time of year that they're not here. But when they're here, it's a higher chance of seeing them in a more open wooded area versus a wetland. Seems contrary to what we're seeing. This down here, these roads and nighttime lights, this is one reason why I blocked this information off the negative association, because it really comes back to land managers. What they're trying to show here is, do we see them in areas where there's a lot of nighttime lights? And they're not. But if you get warblers or whatnot, it's not unusual to see for some of these, let's say during migration, this time of year, there's black up here. And what they're trying to find from the data is what species are most affected during migration from lights and buildings. That's the idea with the roads as well. So I hope that makes sense. For what I was trying to do, I felt like that was a distraction. And that's why I covered it up, because really what I wanted to do is just focus on, hey, what are we going to see them in, and the habitat type. And I wanted to think in broader scales in terms of density of vegetation, type of vegetation, and wet versus dry, and the range between. Because in that real basic terms, I think it's helpful for telling apart species, or where you're more likely to expect them. Because like, was it Roger Troy Pearson, right? Birds have wings and do strange things, right? That's him, right? I think who said that. And so we can find them anywhere. Birds, that is.
Okay,
So,
so we've got a handful of other questions that have come in. So I'll start with the first of those. What Susan Joy is asking, what field book or app source could you recommend that does comparisons?
oh gosh. Well, when it comes to comparisons, the one that I like the most, which I still think that you can get, and it's a desktop, I don't think you can get it on your phone, is, was Thayer's. I don't know if people remember the Thayer software, and I don't look at these and use these that much anymore, and I should keep up with that just for when these questions come through. But the Thayer software, I think, was still available, because I used to recommend it for some of the youth, for the youth programs. So Thayer, and I thought they did a really nice job with recommendations. You know, and this is when what I'm thinking about is ones that does comparisons for you to help you learn about it. That's different, of course, with the Sibley app, for example. You can do these comparisons, you can pull them up side by side, but you have to think about it and do that yourself. It's not doing it for you. So I apologize, I don't think I'm as knowledgeable as I probably should be on that, but Thayer, again, is the one that I would recommend the most, if it's still, I think it's still functional. It was a couple of years ago, or 3 or 4 years ago. So, all right, let's see the next question. Let's see, as our
question is, how about a third presentation? So,
from me, did I do a second one already?
well, I think that you're scheduled for, so this was your first one, if I'm correct, and then if I'm not mistaken, you are scheduled for a second one sometime later in the year, more toward the fall. And I think that Lowell's saying is that this presentation was so phenomenal that we should go ahead and book a third one.
Well, sparrows are phenomenal. I will agree with that. So they help me out. They help me look good. So yes, as our area becomes drier, are other birds likely to migrate here? There's so much. Yes, we're becoming drier. It's a mix of things, because yes, there's definite changes, of course, that we're aware of that's happening with climate change, and it will, birds that are more southerly might be more likely to come up here because it's warmer. But another really critical factor with this is habitat, because it doesn't matter how warm it is. If there's not enough water, water is a big deal nowadays. If there's not enough water, it's going to be hard to have enough food, whether it's insects or plants, to support those birds coming here, right? So no matter what, habitat and available habitat, I think, is still as much or more important than what's happening with climate change. And of course, that goes hand in hand. So I always, water conservation and water preservation, and that sort of stuff is number one here. So, and so that's, I don't mind emphasizing that. There's I don't know if I have any more useful information on that topic. Let's see, Savannah sparrows. Any tips on telling subspecies apart? Well, what I would say is Jim Rising, I considered him, he was the guru. He's passed away now, but I consider him the sparrow guru, and has a couple of the older ID guys that aren't current necessarily with as far as like the species names, but they're great resources nonetheless. So I still highly recommend them. Rising had an article, because a lot of these different subspecies of Savannah sparrows suggested putting them all into just one subspecies, the main type subspecies. There's some other ones that are more obvious, like the large billed and so forth. Those pretty distinctive. But as far as the different subspecies, and it's interesting because if you go all the way back into the times of late 1880s, and when they're first coming up with the checklist, so to speak, or the ALU listing of species here, and Elliott Cows, or coos, some people will say coos, but it's pronounced cows, he said so himself in one of his books, where the individual variation among the Savannah sparrows sometimes was as much as the variation that's documented between the subspecies. So telling them apart, the best bet for that is to do it on the breeding grounds, and then by default it fits into that geographic region that's described as that XYZ subspecies. So there we go. Some subspecies of course are, for others, like the song sparrows, are a little bit easier to differentiate, but not always the same thing. Clinal variation, where things kind of grade from one into the other, it's pretty prevalent there with savannas as well. So that was a kind of a long-winded jumping around response, but hopefully that kind of helped with that. So bottom line is, be careful identifying subspecies. That's the rule. And I'll make one last comment. Sibley, with his field guide, is, he follows that sort of concept. So if you look at, he usually gives, like his subspecies with the song sparrows and so forth, he gives more like a general, not so specific, like this is an interior subspecies, this is a coastal, that sort of thing. It kind of, it's the same idea here, that it's not easy to tell these subspecies apart. So, okay, let's see.
Well, thank you, Homer. It doesn't look like we have any more questions for right now. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of start closing it down. If anyone has any last minute questions, feel free to type them in. But again, Homer, thank you so much for the excellent presentation. That was extremely informative. And thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. We certainly appreciate it. Next month, we have our next general meeting is scheduled for, let me see, April 12th. Pam Flick of Defenders of Wildlife will be talking to us about wolves in California. So stay tuned for announcements and links to registration for that event. And I'd like to remind you all, if you're not already, please follow Fresno Audubon on social media. We are on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And we have also relaunched our YouTube channel. So that's a great way to catch up on recent general meeting presentations, any that you missed, any that you want to watch again, or if anyone that you know missed any and would like to watch them, that's a good place to go and view them. And also our social media, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. That's a really great way to stay in the loop and to, just kind of be aware of upcoming events and things of that nature, and educational content that we put out. So thank you again, everyone. It doesn't look like we have any other questions coming in. So thank you again, Homer. Thank you again, everyone who joined us tonight, and have a great evening, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Hope everyone has a wonderful evening.
Thank you again, Homer.